the recording. So by offering training in healthcare to local populations and medical assistance to the people at highest risk and with the flexibility to respond rapidly to emergency situations, International Medical Corps rehabilitates devastated healthcare systems and brings them back to self-reliance. So I feel that we can learn a lot from the International Medical Corps' experiences and translate it into our own practices and preparedness. Today we're going to hear from two individuals. Kelly Sutter is the Senior Nurse Advisor for International Medical Corps. She's in the preparedness, the medical planning and preparedness unit. She's an experienced emergency department nurse and holds a master's in nursing education. Prior to her current position, she worked 5 years as emergency response nurse for International Medical Corps. She has functioned as a nurse team leader and emergency staff nurse in a field hospital during the 2010 earthquake response in Haiti, the cholera treatment site manager for 3 cholera treatments in northern Haiti in 2011, the primary healthcare coordinator and clinical staff educator in the Malakal IDP camp in 2014 in the height of the civil war in South Sudan, and this is a nurse team leader and clinical Ebola educator in Bong, Liberia, and interim training director in Lansar and Makini, Sierra Leone. I bet I did not say those right, during the current Ebola epidemic, and then most recently the emergency health manager of the mobile medical unit following the recent earthquake in Nepal. I will let her go further into her experience, as I'm sure that she will have many experiences to share with us. The second person that will be speaking today is Catherine Perry. She's the desk officer of medical planning and preparedness at International Medical Corps. Inspired by International Medical Corps' 31 years of experience in over 70 countries worldwide, Perry is responsible for developing the international non-governmental organization's first preparedness and response program within the United States. So, welcome to our monthly webinar, Kelly and Catherine. I don't know which one of you was going to begin, but I'm ready to let you get started.
Okay, hi everyone. This is Catherine Perry. Thank you so much for that introduction and to AHEP for hosting this webinar today, and of course to all of you who are here listening with us. So we hope that this will be informative and an interesting dialogue, and so I will speak for a few minutes just about an overview of the organization itself and a little bit about our mission and history. And then I'm going to leave the majority of the time to Kelly to talk about some of her personal experiences as a humanitarian response nurse. So that said, if you have any questions, please jot those down, and in the last few minutes we will make sure that we leave room for a Q&A. So this is an appropriate day to be having this conversation because today is World Humanitarian Day. So you all, of course, are humanitarians, as are we. And today is really a day to celebrate all of the humanitarians around the world working behind the scenes to provide care to the people who need it most, no matter where. So as you can see from this slide, unless you're joining on audio, there are a few links to our social media where we have some campaigns about World Humanitarian Day. So you can find that on Facebook or on Twitter or Instagram. And of course, you could also join our LinkedIn page as well. So our mission is to improve the quality of life for vulnerable people through healthcare interventions, training, and related activities that build self-reliance. So Christy spoke for a moment in the beginning about our mission and history, and this is what we do all over the world every single day. So we are a global disaster relief, humanitarian, and healthcare training organization. So training is really the cornerstone of International Medical Corps. We've been around for over 31 years now. And over those 31 years, we've delivered over $2 billion in program services, over 70 countries, and we now have nearly 8,000 staff around the world. So that includes anyone from the doctor to the emergency response nurse like Kelly, to someone like me who's sitting in the headquarters in Santa Monica, doing program development and support. We also have technical experts, logisticians, the midwives, and anyone from the first responders to those that are supporting the operations. So as I mentioned, we work in 70 countries on 6 different continents. I think this map may be a little bit out of date now, but we currently operate in about 35 countries. So you can kind of see there, and if you're interested in what the specific programming is in each of these regions, you could visit our website at internationalmedicalcorps.org, and there's a really neat interactive map that we have that you can look at. So our program priorities fall into these 7 categories of emergency response and preparedness, health services support, family and community health, women and children's health, mental health and psychosocial support, water, sanitation and hygiene, and food and nutrition and food security, excuse me. So essentially we work within local communities and we train folks, and over 96% of our staff are local to the region that we work, which helps us to arrive pretty quickly. So we get there first, is what we say, because speed saves lives. You all are involved in emergency preparedness and response and planning, I'm sure. So we all know that those first critical hours are very vital in making sure that as many lives are saved as possible. So here are some different examples, and I'll include a interesting tidbit that I don't know if Kelly will capture later. She will get more into our Nepal response, but we actually had someone on the ground in Nepal during the earthquake who was there on their rest and relaxation leave from West Africa. So because they were there on the ground during the first earthquake, we were able to mobilize really quickly and get folks out as quickly as possible. And we train to multiply our impact. These are some different examples of areas in which we train. Kelly will also talk more in detail about our multi-agency training collaborative, which we call MATCO, which is our Ebola training program. And we go to tough places. We are currently operating in Yemen, and here we have Syria, Somalia, Afghanistan, Rwanda, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and of course, Bosnia. And as I said, we partner with local stakeholders. So whether that be partner NGOs, nonprofit organizations, community-based organizations, local governments, and national governments, we build partnerships on the ground, and that's how we see our work to be sustainable and carried into the future. And we stay for the long term, and that's what really makes the difference. So there are some organizations who are really great at emergency response, and what separates us from other organizations that also do emergency response is that training component and that sustainability throughout the course of however long is needed to help communities rebuild and become more resilient. And here are just a few examples of some of our corporate founders, corporate partners and foundation partners, and some governments and multilateral partners that we work with. And here are just a few examples of academic partners that we work with as well. And now I'm going to have to embarrass my colleague Kelly just a little bit, but we're so proud of her for this. So today the September issue of Vogue was released. And for those of you who may not follow the fashion industry too closely, the September issue is the largest issue of the year. And we actually, Kelly was able to be featured in in this magazine, so we're very proud of her for that. And what I will say is that I ordered my copy online from Amazon, and it arrived in a very fancy box. So if any of you are interested in reading this article and hearing more about Kelly's experience, you could order a copy from Amazon Smile. And if you select International Medical Corps as the charity, then a portion of the proceeds will benefit the organization and our operations. So I'm going to hand it over to Kelly now, and thank you all again so much for joining us.
Well, thank you, Catherine. Yes, it's always a little embarrassing. There's a lot of people and a lot of effort that goes into every single response, and it's always a little humbling and a little almost embarrassing to be the one that's singled out. But I know that I represent a lot of people and I represent a lot of hard work, and so for that I'm very happy. So like Catherine said, my name is Kelly. I've been a nurse for almost 8 years now, working with International Medical Corps for about 5 years. And they asked us to come and give a little webinar about some of the lessons that we've learned from our experience in international disaster response. And I gave it some thought before I started, and while, obviously many of these lessons are easy to identify, in many cases they are as unique as the people and organizations that are responding to that event. So with that in mind, I'm going to pull from my own personal experiences with international disaster relief and use some real life scenarios to illustrate each of these lessons learned. So there's going to be a lot of pictures and a lot of stories, but I think that's probably the best way to really drive home what we learned and why we learned it. And so I want to begin by speaking a little bit about International Medical Corps' work in West Africa with Ebola. We opened our first Ebola treatment unit on September 15, 2014, and that was in Liberia. That was where our first unit was. Since that time, we've built another unit in Liberia. We've built 3 in Sierra Leone. We have 10 SRUs, our screening and referral units, and I'll talk a little bit about those later. And those are in Guinea. And then we also have, like Catherine mentioned, our MACO training program, which has trained hundreds and hundreds of, well, thousands of local professionals, community members, in every single one of the affected countries of, Liberia, Sierra Leone, Guinea, Mali, Guinea-Bissau, and then we're also working on using it in the domestic arena. We'll talk a little bit about that training program in a minute. Ooh, and I seem to have lost my ability to move these slides. Sorry about that. Okay, there we go. So when I was in Liberia, I worked in Bong County, which is about a 3.5-hour drive from Monrovia. I worked there for about 4 months, and my job there was nurse team leader. Like Catherine said, 96% of the staff members in almost every one of our responses are local. And so every time I went in and every time I had a shift, I was responsible for a team of nurses, doctors, nurse aides, etc. And I would function as their team leader inside of the unit. And I also was the lead clinical trainer for our MACO program, our MACO training program. So they would have a classroom setting, and then they would come to me at the actual unit, and I would essentially teach them how to put on PPE, take it off, get them comfortable with passing meds, drawing blood, putting in IVs, so on and so forth. So obviously we'll get into the lessons now, and there's 4 lessons in particular that I want to point out, and the first one is training and capacity. Now I learned personally a lot from my time in West Africa, and I know that International Medical Corps continues to learn a lot from the ongoing response there. But I would have to put this one at the forefront, reinforcing the importance of training and capacity building. It's always a major component of International Medical Corps' response normally, but I would wager to say that it's especially important in environments like West Africa and when we talk about preparedness. We have to help communities, individuals, etc., become their own best first responders. And that is done through education, that is done through training. And just to give you an idea of the importance of education, I want to give you an example of a village called Barpalu. And this is actually a picture of the village. It's almost impossible to reach. It's even further away from the capital of Liberia, which is Monrovia. To get to this village, you have to drive. It's 3 or 4 hours on really, really bad roads. You have to cross a very big river on a homemade canoe, and then you have to hike another 3 to 4 hours through the jungle to get to that village that you see there. In fact, this picture was taken by helicopter because that was the only way we were able to get in order to assess what was going on in the village. And the reason that we had to start focusing on this village was because they had an outbreak, and that outbreak was caused by one little girl. She had gone to Monrovia to visit, it was a relative or a friend, I can't remember exactly, had gotten sick, came back to the village, and then when she was in the village, of course, spread the illness to everybody around her. And it spread like wildfire, especially to the children that were living in this area. And there was, I mean, this village, I've never seen so many children in a village. Unfortunately, most of these patients were very painfully out of our reach because we had no way of getting them from this village to the Ebola treatment unit safely. If they were strong enough, they could walk, make that walk to the river, cross the river, and we would meet them at the other side with our ambulances. But that only was the case in a few cases. Most of them by this point were too sick to get to us. So the focus instead became training and education. In this village, or in a village that's this far removed from all the centralized activities going on, there was a lack of sensitization. A lot of the educational campaigns that the government was forcing or utilizing had not reached them. So they didn't know not to touch an infected patient. They didn't know how to properly bury a deceased person. They didn't know not to share bedding or utensils with a sick patient. So all of that was something they didn't understand. Had the village been trained, had they been educated, had they received that sensitization material, there's a really good chance, obviously, that outbreak would not have been as bad there. Obviously, once we knew about what was going on, we knew the problems that were going on, we knew why it was an issue, we were able to get in there and start training. And we did that in conjunction with a few different organizations because it was so far away and so logistically awful. But we focused on education and teaching the village about the disease and how to stop its spread, how to manage people that were sick. And we saw, obviously, a lot of the cases slow down and eventually get to zero. But, of course, the education was needed before. Had the village had that education before, a lot of those deaths would not have happened. We would have stopped the disease right there in its tracks before it gotten that bad. Now, because we believe so strongly in training and capacity building, International Medical Corps set to work creating the training curriculum basically as soon as we began our West Africa response. And again, that's called the MACO training curriculum. And it's a collaborative that incorporates best practices from organizations such as Doctors Without Borders, World Health Organization, CDC, and then of course us. Since its development, it's actually now been translated into 3 different languages. It's being utilized in 6 different countries, including the US. And it's trained over 2,000 individuals. And those individuals are obviously from a gamut of different arenas. The goal of the program is to give our local communities and healthcare workers the most up-to-date information and obviously best practices to protect themselves and to protect others. And then also goes a long way in giving patients a fighting chance if we have the best information possible. Another important reason it was developed was to protect, obviously, our own staff, to protect them, prepare them, and train them. All of our staff, both local and international, participate in this training program but before they're allowed to function inside of one of our Ebola treatment units. In addition to our own staff, some of the other individuals that we are training are the local healthcare staff in these different countries, and then also staff from other organizations that are going to go in turn and start their own Ebola treatment units. So we trained a lot of them. And then we also focused a lot on the train the trainer concept where, you pull certain people out of an organization or a hospital or whatever setting, you train them and they can go back and train more. And obviously it just grows our potential to train a community exponentially. I am going to mention at this point that we're currently working on adapting the program to the domestic setting. And this is actually a picture of our pilot training program in Texas where we picked out select students and ran a training program for the first time domestically, and we're continuing to develop it in that sense. Now the training program, this MACO training program, is key to the training and capacity building of our staff and local staff communities, and again reinforces this lesson that we learned. And as we continued to learn this lesson, we continued to focus on this training program because we saw the benefits almost instantly. Another example of how important and how much of an impact training can have, I'm going to tell you a little bit about a hospital in Sierra Leone. I did work in Sierra Leone for a little bit as well. And this hospital is called St. John's. It's a referral center with a large catchment arena. You know, a referral center is in Liberia or in Sierra Leone much greater than a referral center in the U.S. When they say referral center in these countries, it's probably one of the only really how do I want to phrase it? Really good hospitals. So people come from very far, very far away to go to this place. But anyway, the hospital had to close. They performed a surgery on a woman who they did not know had Ebola, and as a result, many of the members of the surgical team died, including an Italian surgeon. So of course the hospital closed, as did many other hospitals and clinics throughout Liberia and Sierra Leone. And as you can guess, as a result of this, all the diseases that are normally treated at these healthcare facilities started to going up. And so as the Ebola deaths came down, we still had increasing death rates because people were dying of things such as pneumonia, upper respiratory infections, things that normally had been taken care of. And so it's a big issue. And so what we did, and this is where that screening and referral unit, or SRU, idea came in. It was St. John's was our pilot SRU, or screening and referral unit, and it's exactly what it sounds like. It's a unit that's at the entrance to a clinic or a hospital, and the purpose of it is to screen out any possible infections. So any staff member, any potential patient has to go through this screening facility, and the individuals that screen them are nurses and doctors that have been trained through our MACO training program to identify and appropriately manage any potential Ebola cases. And like I said, MACO is absolutely essential, because if our staff didn't know how to identify or manage a possible case, then it was pointless. Now the SRU is still up and running at St. John's. It's screened thousands of patients, and it's singled out a number of patients that were potential cases, and appropriately manage them and appropriately move them to the correct facility for management. And as a result, St. John's is open. It's been able to run. It's providing health care. So it's been able to do amazing things. And like I said, we've opened quite a few of these SRUs in other places because they were so successful. So that is exactly what local community preparedness and education looks like. That is what it's capable of accomplishing. It's allowing a community to have a capacity to be its own first responder. The area around St. John's, that catchment area, is now able to respond on their own. And everybody that we trained, everybody that's working there is local. They're nurses and doctors that were already working at that hospital. We gave them the tools to respond appropriately and to manage an event, to manage a disease before it gets to such proportions that a hospital has to close, or half of a village is dying, and so on and so forth. That is what training and capacity looks like. That is what it's capable of doing. So obviously we can apply our lessons learned and importance of training and capacity building to the domestic preparedness arena as well. Training and education is something that we can easily incorporate into our local domestic preparedness plans. I mean, yes, easier said than done, but it's a lot easier than trying to handle the results of a unprepared disaster afterwards. If communities, if individuals, if hospitals and businesses, if all of them know how to respond in a given situation, the destructive reach of that event can be limited significantly. I mean, we can use Ebola again as an example, Ebola in the U.S. Though Ebola in the U.S. will never, ever look like it has in West Africa for many reasons, we still were really, really lucky. The next time around, we may not be that lucky. If we're not ready, if we're not trained, if everybody from, the head CEO of a hospital to the local bus driver, if they're not trained, if they don't know how to identify a potential threat and how to manage that potential threat until the appropriate people get to it, we may not be so lucky. As they call it, the Ebola next may be much worse than what we saw in the U.S. recently. It's one of the easiest ways to mitigate a disaster, training and capacity building. Another lesson that we need to talk about, or that I personally think is important from disaster response, is the importance of cultural sensitivity. We all know this, especially today, that it's imperative to be sensitive to the differences of cultures and traditions around us. But unfortunately, it's usually considered least important when it's actually most important. If we don't understand a culture, if we don't understand local traditions, response efforts, and more importantly, preparedness efforts will be hindered. This is a picture of our burial grounds. We were very lucky to have a spot to actually bury patients. Let me give you another example. In October, last October, I was in Sierra Leone and happened to meet a gentleman from the CDC. And in an informal conversation, he told me that the CDC had estimated 50% of Ebola cases in the beginning were caused by contact with a dead body. And that makes sense considering an individual is most contagious when their viral load is the highest, so at death. And then also taking into account the elaborate funeral traditions that are common in West Africa. Naturally, obviously with those statistics, it seems simple that the solution is to take care of the deceased victims as quickly and safely as possible. The problem is that the methods that we had to utilize, especially in the city, in places like Monrovia where there's no burial area, was cremation, and that is not culturally acceptable in West Africa. There's a story of one gentleman who went to an Ebola treatment unit in Monrovia. When he got there, he was already sick, already symptomatic, obviously, and they told him that if he died, he would be cremated. So of course he jumped the fence, jumped on his motorbike, and bolted, and he actually ran to a village not far from where I was working in Bong County, Liberia. He went to the village, and his family and friends took him in. They took care of him, and then they buried him in secret. They knew enough to know that you weren't supposed to be burying them, which is why they buried him in secret. Of course, not long afterwards, others from the village became symptomatic, and by the time the outbreak was finished, 60% of that village was dead. That village was almost completely wiped out. Now, like I said, the Ebola treatment units in the city didn't have very many options, especially when the outbreak was at its worst. They had to cremate. We were very lucky. We actually had, being in the essentially a forest, we actually had a spot to bury patients, and again, this is another picture of that. So that's not an issue that we had to deal with, but it was an issue in other places, and we had to deal with some of the consequences of, for example, that man jumping the fence and driving to a city near us. Eventually, even the ETUs in the city, the Ebola treatment units in the city, found a way of merging the need for infection control with cultural burial traditions. So they did find a way of meeting this culture and meeting these people where they're at, but unfortunately the misunderstanding of cultural norms and traditions had a very, very heavy price in this case. Now, of course, International Medical Corps saw this. We saw the repercussions of that, and we took note, of similar events, and we understood the need to be especially in tune with the local culture and traditions. We constantly tried to think of different ways to engage the community in our efforts, to understand the culture and traditions in the area, and also to fight the rumors and misconceptions that were running so rampant through the region at the time. A couple examples of that. For example, our ambulances were literally trucks with big orange tarps, and there's a picture later on I'll show you, wrapped around the backside of the truck, and that was our ambulance. And we had a lot of issues sometimes. We would pull into a village, and as we got out and identified the patients, asked the patient to get in the back of the truck, they'd turn around, being as sick as they were, and a number of them would take off running through the woods, literally take off running. And of course, we're not going to chase them in PPE. But rather than just, force them or bring law enforcement along with us or whatever else we could have done, we ended up sitting down with different community leaders and figuring out what was going on, why patients were running. And of course, it boiled down to a lot of fear. There was a lot of misconceptions. A lot of people believe that we were there to, harvest organs even. There's a lot of really, really bad rumors going around. And once we understood what was going on, we could fix that problem. And so in this case, we actually created a flip chart with lots of pictures, everything from what their bed would look like to a picture of the food they would be eating, what their bathroom looked like, and we would literally sit down and go through this flip chart with the patient and whatever community or family members wanted to watch. And by the time we got to the end of that, they were much more willing to get in. They were much more comfortable, and obviously other family members were comfortable with it as well. So as other people got sick, we had less and less resistance to bringing patients in. Another example is, in West Africa, family is very, very important. And so our confirmed unit in Bong County had a phone, and that phone was managed by the healthiest patient. And so patients could call out when they ever wanted, and family members could call in whenever they wanted. Another example is in West Africa, when someone's sick, they have essentially the African version of chicken noodle soup. It's called fufu, and it's quite nasty. I tried it. Wasn't a fan of it. But it's their comfort food. It'd be like getting chicken noodle soup in the US. And once we understood that that's something that they're accustomed to, that that's common, that's what makes them comfortable, we made sure that was available to them in case they wanted it every day. And so we tried to mesh what we needed to protect ourselves, what we needed to protect the community, and what we needed to bring the epidemic to an end. But also obviously mesh it with what they needed, what they could understand, and what they were comfortable with. And that went a very, very long way of having good outcomes and helping us end this epidemic faster. This is a picture of one of our youngest patients, 3-year-old Sata. And this is actually a picture of our absolute youngest survivor, little Josephine. So learning to be culturally aware and culturally sensitive is just as important, obviously, in the United States. If we understand a community, if we understand its people, we can better understand their needs and better serve them. Now, I've actually heard people in the U.S. tell me, like, well, it's not as important in the U.S. We're a developed country, and everybody already knows, kind of what they're doing, what's different, what works, what doesn't work, but it's not true. A preparedness plan or activity in, for example, upstate New York is going to look very, very different than a similar plan or activity in a remote Appalachian Mountain community. It's going to be very, very different. And if you would try to approach one with the ideas of the other, the traditions or cultural norms of the other place, it's going to cause some issues. It's not going to be as effective. If we want to be effective in preparing and responding to local and national disasters, then we need to take the time to understand who we are working with and what approach will best suit them. So I'm also going to talk a little bit about our Nepal response, because also, like every disaster, every epidemic, we learn a lot from each and every single response. So just a quick little background on the Nepal earthquake. It was April 25th, 2015. The earthquake was a 7.8 magnitude. It left about 9,000 dead, injured 23,000, and cost $5 billion in damage. Now, International Medical Corps ran mobile medical units during the initial emergency response in 2 of the most damaged districts of Nepal, and those districts are Gorkha and Dading. Now, these regions are highly, highly remote, obviously making the response especially logistically difficult. In fact, just to get to these regions, we had to take a helicopter, and this is actually a picture of the helicopter that we were using primarily. And once we were in one of these mountain villages, we'd run a medical clinic and camp out in the village for 2 days, and then go back to the district, reload our supplies, and then head back out once we got another destination from the Ministry of Health. So like Catherine mentioned, we work very closely with local government agencies, local NGOs, and they were the ones that were telling us where they needed help, and we would go there on their call. Now, obviously, International Medical Corps is not still running mobile medical units. They're only effective usually in very logistically difficult areas and in the very initial part of a response. But we've now moved on to recovery and response, which includes working to restore primary health care, rebuilding health clinics, and healthcare system strengthening. So right now we have 3 mobile physical therapy units. We have 2 facilities that are supporting the local Gorkha District Hospital. We've rebuilt 12 health posts, and they've actually established an orthopedic hotline so patients can easily schedule care and follow up. So a lot of good things still happening there. So a couple of the lessons that we learned there's a couple of them. The first one is the importance of having a streamlined process and response in any type of disaster. especially when things like logistics are such a determining factor. As with all of our previous responses, we worked very closely, like I said, with local ministries of health, local leaders, and Nepal was no different. In each district in Nepal, and in many cases sometimes each individual village, the response was handled differently. This lack of streamlined process and a streamlined response led to both gaps and overlaps in overall response efforts. Let me give you an example of that. One of the remote villages that we worked in, that the Ministry of Health asked us to go to, is a place called Dharka. And this is actually a picture of individuals waiting in line at our mobile clinic in Dharka. But when we got there, we found that, we got there to find people already bandaged up. Healthcare had already been administered. They already had a few more supplies and tents. And obviously yes, we could have done more work there, but it wouldn't have been the best use of our time because another NGO had already been there. Luckily, our helicopter company that we were utilizing was very flexible. We were able to get back on the helicopter and head to another remote village that needed care and had not received any care after the earthquake. But unfortunately, we wasted some valuable time and some valuable resources. It was an overlap. More importantly, sometimes this lack of district ministries of health coordinating with each other leads to gaps, not just overlaps, but gaps. An example of that is another mountain village that we worked in. When we got there, found out that it had not received any type of aid, and at this point we were 2 weeks out from the earthquake. In this village was a woman named Layama, and she's actually the woman that's in this picture with me. She had broken her ankle and her foot. We're not sure which one. We didn't obviously have x-ray in the field. But she had to keep working to support her family and herself. Luckily, we were able to airlift her with the helicopter, get her to the capital where she could get some treatment. But this poor woman did manual labor on a broken foot for literally 2 weeks because that was the only way her family was going to survive. A lack of coordination and a lack of an understandable and streamlined response led to this gap and also led to the overlap that was mentioned earlier. We had districts with essentially soft borders. When you get into these remote mountain villages, it's not like a county where there's a sign that says welcome to Michigan or welcome to Oakland County. None of that's there, obviously. You can cross into another district without even realizing it, cross into another village without even realizing it. And so there's soft borders. And so some of these villages, certain parts could be claimed by one district or by the other, or vice versa, that they say it's not their problem and the other district says it's not their problem. So this lack of coordination and this lack of a streamlined response caused a lot of issues with NGOs like International Medical Corps. It made our response efforts sometimes slow, sometimes less effective than they could have been. And the same principle can be utilized obviously domestically. A major part of preparedness is making sure that everyone knows what must be done during an event and how they fit into that response puzzle when the time comes. If you have 50 different possible response pathways, if you have 50 different reporting lines, you're basically guaranteed a scattered and unorganized response. Obviously, there's going to be different variations to any type of response depending on, like I said, that whatever community you're in, you're going to have to gear it towards them. But there needs to be one very clear and very easy to understand response process, and all parties involved need to be committed to that streamlined effort. The only way the response will be effective and all available resources will be utilized to full capacity is to have that underlying structure, that streamlined process, that infrastructure underneath that process, the infrastructure underneath that response, and then you adapt it as needed to whatever community you're in. But it's got to be understandable, it's got to be simple, it's got to be easy to implement. Otherwise, it's not going to happen, and things like, the disorganization that occurred in Nepal sometimes will happen, and gaps happen, and overlaps happen. And we don't want that, obviously, to happen when especially human beings are involved. The final lesson that I'd like to talk about today was also a lesson that we learned in Nepal, also obviously in West Africa as well, is the importance of teamwork within our organization and then also organizations outside of us. Every organization, every agency, every government, etc., has many different units that are essential to the organization's function and identity. Unfortunately, many times these units become kind of siloed. They begin to function as if they are independent rather than as a single part to a larger entity. If you imagine like an engine, an engine functions better when every individual part is working correctly and working in conjunction with the rest of the engine. A single part malfunctions, the entire engine can fail. Now, just to illustrate this, I'm going to use an example of International Medical Corps' psychosocial unit. Before I flip, this is a picture of one of our mobile medical units. We were running it out of a temporary school in Nepal. So with International Medical Corps, our psychosocial team is considered an essential part of any emergency phase, so much so that they're deployed basically at the same time the medical team is, if not very, very close behind. In Nepal, we had, in one case, a woman show up to the clinic. She had walked, I think it was 8 or 9 hours to get to us. She signed in, and she signed in without a single physical complaint. Now, because she had walked 8 or 9 hours, we agreed to let her be seen by a doctor just because of how far she had come. Long story short, we found out that her daughter had died in the earthquake. The house collapsed on her. And now she is the sole caregiver to 2 very, very young grandchildren. And if I remember correctly, her husband's either out of town in another area, living in a different country, working, or he had passed away, one of the two, but the husband wasn't in the picture, the grandfather. She didn't have any physical complaints whatsoever, but she needed someone to talk to. She simply needed someone to listen and to acknowledge her pain. In West Africa with Ebola, I'd go as far to say that mental health was sometimes critical to a patient's survival. We had one man in West Africa who was actually from Barpalu, the village we talked about recently, and his wife had gotten sick. He was taking good care of his wife. A few days later, his little daughter got sick. Unfortunately, she was only sick for about a few days before she finally passed away. And he buried her, and the day after the funeral, he got sick. And he knew he couldn't take care of his wife if he was sick, and so he got out of the village immediately, knowing that he needed to be strong enough to actually walk to our Ebola treatment unit. And so he came to our Ebola treatment unit. We tested him. He was positive for Ebola. We checked him in. And a few days later, we found out that his wife had passed away in the village. And that night, he had a dream, and in that dream, he said that he was sleeping next to his wife, and he took that as a sign that it was time for him to die, that he needed to die. And so he stopped eating, he stopped drinking, and he refused any type of medical care. Now, this is obviously where we would send our psychosocial team in. And our psychosocial team in West Africa had not only international mental health professionals, but local health professionals, mental health professionals. And then we also had pastors, we also had survivors, anyone that might help reach these patients. And so we sent them in, and they were able to spend some time with him. They were able to talk him through the beginning of this grieving process, enough so that he was at least able to start eating and drinking again and accepting treatment. So during a stressful disaster relief response, it's tempting to rank units within an organization according to their importance. And obviously, psychosocial is not always the top of that list, and I'm as guilty of that as anybody. I remember the one day in West Africa, we had an ambulance show up, a couple of ambulances just kept coming in, and we got, I think it was 13 patients in 1 hour. Each one you have to send somebody, 2 more people in PPE, start IVs. I mean, it's a lot of work, a lot of exhausting work. And so at moments like that, even I am tempted to think like psychosocial is not that important. They just need to wait. That unit is not essential right now. But that's not true. That is not always true. Most of the time it's not true. So why am I talking about the psychosocial unit? It's because the psychosocial unit is a very essential part of our organization. And without them, our response in Nepal, in West Africa, anywhere, would have been possible. It would have been accomplished, but it would not have been as successful as it was. They brought value, they brought hope, they brought creativity, they brought alternative approaches. By supporting the function of the psychosocial team was in turn able to support the medical team. And that teamwork resulted in a much better outcome for both patients in West Africa, Nepal, both physically and psychologically. Everything has to be done in a team effort. An organization or an agency comprised of isolated units is not a functional organization or an agency. To be effective in both emergency preparedness and response, we need to work as a team within our own organization, with each unit valuing and investing time and effort into understanding and supporting other units within that organization or that agency. It's the only way to be fully effective. It's the only way to reach our full potential, and at our full potential, help communities be prepared. And of course, if it gets to that point, help respond to whatever event happens. This is a picture of a Christmas in Liberia. All the staff came together to come up with a few ideas to make Christmas as wonderful as possible for our patients. And so the ending result was spray painting PPE to look like, elves and Santa Claus and snowmen. And it actually had a very, very uplifting result. The patients absolutely loved it. Now, similarly, we also need to talk about organizational partnerships. I mean, it's obviously important that all the individual units within an organization are working closely together and supporting each other, but we also need to look outside of our borders. In both Nepal and West Africa, we relied on support from other NGOs and local ministries of health in order to be as effective as possible. Now, obviously, we could have functioned independently, but sharing knowledge, sharing resources allowed us to continue to have the greatest impact. It bolstered our capacity. And in the same sense, we need to look outside of our borders in the U.S. Within the U.S., not outside of the U.S. If we want to be prepared for an emergency as a state, as a country, as a hospital, or as a business, we can't be afraid to ask for support or to join forces with other organizations or agencies. A unified response is an effective response. And that was actually, let me flip back, that's actually what our ambulances looked like. Those are our ambulances in West Africa. So just to recap a little bit, the lessons International Medical Corps has learned throughout the way, more importantly, the lessons that I have come out with, are first and foremost the absolute importance of training and capacity building. It's absolutely paramount to preparedness efforts. If you don't have this component, you can't be prepared. Secondly, it's cultural sensitivity. By understanding our surroundings, we can more easily be prepared for any type of variable, and in many cases prevent many issues in the first place. The next one is obviously the streamlined processes and responses. Once we have identified a target population, we've taken steps to understand that population, we've taken steps to prepare that population, to train that population, then we need to look at creating a response process for the unthinkable moment when our greatest relief efforts, our greatest preparedness efforts rather, are not enough. And of course, this process needs to be very clear, very easy to implement, and very easy to follow. And then finally, the importance of teamwork and organizational partnerships. Preparedness would not be complete without efforts to ensure an organization or agency is working as a unified entity, and that all resources, both inside of the organization and outside, are being used to support preparedness and to support response efforts if it gets to that point. And so I'm going to open it up for some questions right now. And there should be a box to your side. Maybe, Christy, you can direct this, where you can type in a question and either myself or Catherine will be able to answer for you.
Thank you, Kelly. What an excellent presentation and a good reminder for all of us of the good work that's going on across the world. This is amazing. The Q&A box is to the left-hand side of your screen at this time. You should be able to type in questions there in that small box. Just checking to make sure. And then when you type, be sure to hit enter. And when you hit enter, it will come to us and we'll be able to see that question and have one of our presenters answer the questions that you have. Above, on the top left-hand corner of your screen, you can see that there are web links, various web links that were provided during the presentation. Feel free to click on any of those web links to direct you to any of the things that you'd like to hear more about or see more information on. As for this presentation, I do want to let you guys know or remind you, especially those of you that may have had a conflict that came up during the session and logged in maybe later than you had hoped to log in. This session was recorded and will be posted online shortly following the completion of the event. So be sure to look on the ahep.org website under recorded webinars, and you should be able to see this webinar and all the other webinars that we've hosted as monthly webinars in the past. Looks like we have a question here for Kelly. It says, Kelly, in an era dominated by globalization, novel disease events in developing nations may be just a flight away. Witness what happened in Dallas. What could our healthcare infrastructure take out of the Ebola experience to help change our current preparedness paradigm?
Can you hear me?
Yes.
I'm sorry, let me pull this back up here. That's a really good question. And like you said, Margella, Pete Margella, the borders are not, it used to be, if something happened overseas or in another country, sometimes even in another state, it wasn't an issue. It wasn't something that we had to think about. It was something we read on the news or saw on TV, no big deal. But people travel a lot now. There's a lot of, just a lot of traveling and stuff like that. Road systems, especially over in, Africa and Europe and all this kind of stuff are much better. So the potential to spread all these types of new diseases and stuff is astronomical, and we've seen the results of that. So what we could do as a healthcare, in infrastructure, to take Ebola experience and help change our current preparedness paradigm. I mean, I'd have to say that probably the biggest things, and again, this is me taking my personal experience from West Africa, from Nepal, and my own experience working as an ER nurse. The streamlined process and response. I've worked at a number of different hospitals within the U.S., and every single hospital I have been to has a different response plan, even down to how to manage, for example, contaminated PPE. And this was even before Ebola. Everybody did it differently. Everybody has different standards. And I don't just mean variations based on what supplies are available. I mean, even if the same supplies were available, they were following a completely different response. And so even as a nurse, going from hospital to hospital, it got to a point where I didn't know what each hospital's response was. I had so many different things going on in my mind as, a new grad, where one hospital does this, one hospital does this, and then you can't remember which hospital was which. It's confusing. And that's in a first world developed country. And I'm a nurse that's had lots of training, and it was confusing for me. So had a disaster happen at that moment, I wouldn't have known exactly what needed to happen. It would have delayed that response. It would have caused problems. If it had been Ebola at that time, obviously someone would have gotten sick. Healthcare workers would have gotten sick. Another thing I'm going to point out is, this is a sore spot I know for many, but is what happened when all the healthcare workers came back from West Africa. And then from personal experience, you're cheered on as a hero while you're over there, but the moment you walk into the U.S., oh my gosh, like I got back in February, and I still have people that when they find out I was in West Africa take 3 steps back. And I'm not talking about, people on the street. I'm talking about highly, highly educated physicians, highly educated individuals that still have not educated themselves or have not looked at the facts. So when I got back from West Africa, I ended up having to go to a different area. I went to stay with a friend because the option of going home was not an option. One of my family members, their job had basically told them that even though I was not going to be at the same house, because I'm related, they were not going to be able to work for at least 30 days. The job that I was supposed to have when I got back from West Africa was going to make me take 3 months off just to be safe. So these are people that should definitely be able to read the facts. These are people that are definitely able to understand. But the problem was that in the same way that our processes for disaster preparedness within hospitals and stuff are not streamlined, it's all different. When people were coming back from West Africa, nothing was streamlined. In fact, workers in West Africa, I mean, this sounds horrible, but we were researching what type of restrictions we were going to have based on what area we went back to, and that's where we would pick. That's how we would pick where we were going to go, where we were going to spend our quarantine. You know, I mean, it was that different in each and every single state, each and every single county, and that was a problem. I mean, and that's where a lot of that confusion came from, and that's where a lot of the confusion still comes from, is that there was never one approach from the U.S. This is what it is. This is what needs to be done. This is how we're going to do it. These are our recommendations. It was very much left to each and every local department to manage it on their own. But they, correct me if I'm wrong, but they weren't giving exactly the tools that they needed. And I know Ebola's new. I know that Ebola is not something that we were prepared for, that we expected to cross into our borders. But this is the reality now, that there's going to be things where we didn't expect to come. There's going to be things that we are not expecting, and we need to be ready. We need to have that underlying infrastructure, that underlying streamlined response, so that we can just open up that diagram or that infrastructure and just start plugging in the pieces that we need, plugging in all the different people, all the different resources, so on and so forth. So, Margella, did this answer your question at all? I know I kind of tailed off there a little bit.
Kelly, he probably, I was going to say he probably can't respond.
Oh, I thought
yes.
he can't type in. Okay.
Yes, he did.
Oh, he did. Okay.
There are a couple of more questions in. Oops. Do you have
okay.
Do you have time to answer those? I'm going to let you determine.
Sure. The next question is, I'll read it for you. Did you think the use of the WHO FMTs that had registered prior to deployment made a difference in the coordination of the response? I'm sure it did. I wasn't there right when the response began. I came a week into the response. So Catherine might be able to answer this more clearly. I know she's read through some of the data. But I think they did. Obviously, anything that helps us prepare, anything that helps us with the response is going to be helpful. I mean, I guess I really can't speak to this one a whole lot.
Yeah, I think just to say real briefly, this question, it's a really great question, and it also is sort of similar to the other question that came in that was in regard to response organizations being able to be self-sufficient when they arrive on the ground. And the simple answer is yes, of course. There's a lot of really goodwill out there, and a lot of folks that really want to help and do the right thing and have some very high technical skills that would lend to them being able to be an effective first responder. But of course, without that kind of support of an organization that has the experience and can foresee the potential barriers that may come up, there are often in emergency responses a lot of groups that kind of self-deploy or wind up there when they may add more chaos to the situation. So that's of course what we all in our preparedness efforts, what you all work to do to try to avoid, right? And there are a couple other really good questions, and I know we're going over time now. So I just would like to invite all of you to visit the links that we put out on this web link portion of the webinar, and also to go ahead and tweet us if you have further questions. We can try to make sure that somebody from the organization addresses those. And of course, our Twitter handle is @IMC_worldwide. You can also visit our Facebook page at facebook.com/International Medical Corps. We also have a YouTube channel with a lot of really great videos and a lot of resources on our website as well. So I just want to take this moment to say thank you very much again to the Association of Healthcare Emergency Preparedness Professionals for hosting us today. And thank you to Kelly for your time here, and to all of you as participants. Thank you so much. And happy Humanitarian Day to all of you. I think we all have a lot of work to do and a lot of things to be proud of as well. So that said, I think this would conclude it from our end, and I'll hand it over to Christy to finalize that.
Yes, thank you. Thank you, Catherine, and to Kelly for all of your expertise in sharing that with our members and our presentation participants. We really appreciate your time, and we also, I want to just take the time to thank you so much for all of the very important work that you do across the globe. You make this world a better place. So, please feel free to visit the Association for Healthcare Emergency Preparedness Professionals in the future for additional topics and additional webinars. Again, feel free to email me at ksanger@ahep.org with any questions, concerns, comments, or suggestions. Thanks again for all of your time today, and we will see you next time.